After revitalizing the cycle of their youthful Sherlock Holmes with the first chapter of a new epic, the men from Frogwares had many more ideas in the works, but the onset of the war compelled them to postpone the works on an ambitious open world. As a result, they chose to focus their efforts on a smaller scale but nonetheless charming project. Mr. Sherlock Holmes The Awakened is a recreation of the 2007 Frogwares game of the same name, redone on a graphic and entertaining level to provide the audience his unlikely and interesting mix between Arthur Conan Doyle and Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Before proceeding, it is worth emphasizing an important point. It is clear that the game, which was funded through a Kickstarter campaign, was created in a context that was far from ideal for creatives, who had to deal with bombings, constant power outages, and other issues resulting from the ongoing conflict. In essence, regardless of the final result, we ask that you allow the team all extenuating circumstances and approach the adventure with the arduous circumstances that surely mark the title's gestation in mind. The tenant of 221B Baker Street is a rising star among English investigators, capable of perfectly combining his mental lucidity with a compulsive passion that prohibits him from leaving out any trail, no matter how relevant it is. Sherlock Holmes is back in London after a task on the island of Cordona that challenged him both physically and mentally. His routine consists of melancholy violin solos and feverish searches for fresh cases to solve. To keep him company is the one man in the world who can put up with his quirky snobbery, John Watson, a doctor tired of his job, still scarred by the horrors of war, and now resolved to turn the page by becoming a novelist. The detective's days are defined by great ideas and silly arguing, and just one of the latter begins to emerge when he sees the absence of the newspaper The Strand from his desk. The former doctor has plenty of simple and plausible reasons for this typical occurrence, but Holmes has already started fantasizing about an insane conspiracy against him, most likely out of irritation over an unsolved theft case. Determined to solve the mystery, the detective sharpens his synapses and embarks on an outlandish manhunt, which, obviously, fails. We'll conclude with a seemingly innocuous finding, paving the way for a current missing case, which in turn reveals information on a far more worrisome string of abductions. Following the trails that lead them from the London fog to the Swiss Alps and ultimately to the marshes of New Orleans, Holmes and Watson are plunged into the dark plans of an occult sect. The investigator, sure of a principle that has always helped him solve multiple cases, eliminated the impossible. What remains, however improbable, must be the truth, will have to cope with a reality that the human intellect just cannot comprehend. The plot offered by Frogwares pens is a fascinating series of more difficult crimes, like an avalanche that intensifies along a downward path, that unravels through the brilliant but reasonable intuitions of a protagonist compelled to stare into the abyss. The Sherlock who comes to life in The Awakened is a version of the character we've grown accustomed to seeing in many other works devoted to the world's most famous detective, as witty on the crime scene as he is intolerable in conversation, a master of deduction who veers dangerously close to the shores of sociopathy. At his side is an accommodating but not chained Watson, who would prove to be a lifeline multiple times for the troubled psyche of a Holmes scared of the unknown, thanks to a shared experience. The developer's scenario evolves in 8 chapters, and as many hours of play, that frequently border on the elusive lunacy of the buried deity of Chulhu, but never fully embrace it, maintaining firmly on the shore of a realistic story, despite disturbing qualities. In short, the original mix of the Master of Terror and Arthur Conan Doyle contains a much larger portion of the latter, while the cosmic horror is only whispered and revealed in a limited number of sequences set in a parallel dimension that reveals the human species' incredible insignificance in comparison to the vast astral planes. The story moves at a steady pace, which must compensate for the obvious slowing of a playful mix devoted to introspection. That said, while it never becomes boring due to the lack of unnecessary fillers, the writing lacks originality, which, combined with a not always impeccable dubbing for interpretation, particularly with regard to the secondary characters, may disappoint those who expected a plot that differed from a typical detective story, and is also hampered by a somewhat weak ending. Our Sherlock Holmes follows the thin trail of clues that leads to the truth within a small number of freely explorable, but small-sized, open scenarios. The mechanics are very similar to those seen in the latest Frogwares adventure, and include a plethora of possibilities, including the visual observation of suspects to establish a psychological profile, the search for identifiable traces only using the concentration, and the questions asked of passers-by in ordered. Each of these activities provides Sherlock with valuable clues that will be required to make the necessary connections to the evidence found at the various crime scenes, allowing the sequence of events that led to the crime to be reconstructed, directing the protagonist to the next stage of an increasingly perilous journey. The amusing recipe necessitates paying attention to the events and clues gathered, and is praised for the scarcity of indications that guide the investigations. They are chosen at the start of the voyage like modifiers, enticing the user to sharpen and continue the adventure. The level of difficulty is by no means insurmountable, and the solution to an enigma is frequently more than obvious. But personal intuition is not one of the game mechanics, which is why it is necessary to reach the goal by slavishly following the rules of the gameplay, find all the clues, discuss the investigation with certain people, reconstruct the entire temporal sequence of the crime, without the possibility of skipping some steps that may appear obvious. From this vantage point, the first hours appear less intuitive, during which you must become acquainted with all of Holmes's skills, particularly because the collection of clues is not unique and direct, but the evidence is scattered among objects to be found, testimonies to elicit from suspects, and epiphanies built in the famous mental palace, which can be viewed as a sort of conceptual map through which the detective makes his connections. A few optional missions intersperse the story by allowing Sherlock to solve other petty crimes using the same deductive and game mechanics, but even in these cases, the writing isn't particularly exciting or original, though the subtle references to characters from Arthur Conan Doyle's and H.P. Lovecraft's creative universe scattered among the tasks and explorable areas are nice. The adventure into the insane depths of knowledge will take the detective to gruesome crime scenes and visions that test one man's sanity, similar to Frogwares' latest exploration of the theme, which you can always retrieve with our review of The Sinking City, but above all common environments brought to the screen by a not very inspired artistic direction, which obviously has to compromise with a certainly not exorbitant budget. If the big buildings of London are greyed by the typical English haze, the American sun of New Orleans adds warmth to the core portions of the novel, while a visit to the Swiss asylum recalls the classic locations of unsettling hospitals. Other restrictions of the title include a limited visual rendering, ranging from polygonal models that can be evaluated to an animation sector that lacks diversity and precision. The complete experience that Frogwares published in 2007 has been reconstructed using the Unreal Engine, and despite the roughness and forgivable asset recycling, it is clearly more appealing than the original, generating a distinct visual homogeneity with Chapter 1. The Awakened plainly wishes to provide an experience that is driven more by its narrative worth than by its technological merit, and in this regard, we are willing to overlook some random bugs or crashes. When it moves away from the plot's good atmosphere of disquiet, the work is actually inclined to a barely concealed pathos that affects the plausibility of its protagonists, creating a strong contrast with that nucleus of cosmic terror that it seeks to convey. The dialogues are alternately dramatic or unintentionally comical due to the sometimes over-the-top tones, as are the somewhat stereotypical characters who convince but without surprising for their inventiveness, while the direction tries to break the immobility of the numerous conversations through lateral or crooked shots aimed at emphasizing the exchanges, sometimes reaching excesses that fail to captivate to the end.